And opening opposition.
Hi, Joe is speaking first, here day.
No, I'm speaking second, here day.
Cool. Closing government.
Yeah, speaking first, I'll second the preference. Yeah, I'll second.
Oh, sorry. Okay, cool. Closing opposition.
Mary first, Shirley, please.
Marina will preference.
All right, excellent. So with all the introductions done, without further ado, we call on the Prime Minister please to open the case of sense in the Oh, actually, before that, does anyone?
Yeah, it's here. This House believes that it's in the interest of post-Soviet Central Asian states to pivot away from Russia and develop closer political and economic ties with China.
No, got it. Okay, thank you so much. All right, Prime Minister, whenever you're ready, you have the floor.
Okay, by the way, what PY is like, don't shout, just stand up. I can see you, I'll get to you. Panel, when Russia has been economically stagnating for years and is now having major sanctions, we think it's important for these states to pivot away from Russia and go instead to China, which is giving huge loans to developing nations. So what I'm going to explain is why China has the best interest and is a good actor for these loans, then I'm going to explain why Russia is a bad actor. So why is China a good actor? Know that they give massive loans and help with infrastructure with the One Belt One Road initiative. Why do they do this? Two major reasons. Firstly, know that China doesn't want to create wants to create a middle class, doesn't want to fall in the middle class trap. What does this mean? That means that at the moment that you have a rise in your wages, you become like competitively outcompeted with other countries that have lower wages, and therefore you're unable to compete on the lower class. However, because you haven't developed your middle status, like middle industry enough, you're also unable to compete enough with other countries to create middle class. That is why in the status quo they are having a lot of like infrastructure plans to be able to make sure that they're still competing in the lower class, while still now also having a lot of money going into the middle class industries to make sure that they're able to develop. But secondly, also know that they just want to make sure that more countries are going to be on their side for example, voting in Taiwan or other situations within the UN, and therefore they're willing to give these loans to make sure that people are going to agree with them. So then why are the loans going to be good? So firstly know that they want to keep you happy and aligned with them, right? Firstly, because oftentimes the states we're talking about have a huge export of oil and gas, and China needs this to actually become like still competitive, right? Because they need to have these huge industries where they produce stuff. That is why they need this, for example, producing plastic, but also just for the heat in the factories and also the transport cost, etc. That is why they have been importing massive gas and have building pipelines within these nations already. We therefore say, also secondly, specifically, they don't want to become dependent on the Myanmar Strait, where you have more pro-US states within the region of Indonesia, meaning at the moment, let's say some hypothetically US wants to cut them off, they now can have to do that via the Myanmar Strait. Now they can actually get gas via land, and therefore they're less dependent on the US blockading them with their huge marine. But therefore say, that is why they actually want to make sure that you are happy, because they need that constant gas from your specific region. But secondly, also know that at the moment that you're going to make these loans bad and they're going to be angry at you, not only other countries will not take the loans anymore, but also the country themselves is much more likely to now have a anti-China government going to be after you at the moment you're going to be in economic crisis, right? We therefore say that also because they want to continue support of you, they're willing to give these loans well, right? But also thirdly, at the moment these countries default, right? Firstly, China loses its investments, which means that they just get major debt, and secondly, also know that other countries don't want to align, which is why they have been very careful with actually taking these loans and making countries default. They have, for example, putting more money in Pakistan the moment it was defaulting, because they want to make sure that it was economically developing better. Only in very extreme cases, as in the Sri Lanka port that they needed for the Myanmar Strait analysis, are they willing to kind of like have a lease for 99 years and take that as collateral, right? We therefore say they're very hesitant, and we therefore see that actually these loans aren't death traps. So what is the impact of this? Firstly, know that they're willing to build an infrastructure for you, right? This is like gas lines, these are like roads, these are like things like distribution centers, ports, and all those kinds of things, which have huge economic spillover effects, right? At the moment you now have better ports, you're also better able to have more workers employed there. At the moment you have more workers employed there, they spend more within your economy, meaning that also other shops can open up, and you're able to now develop more in different sectors as well. But secondly, also note that at the moment that China is now pivoting away towards the lower class industries, they're willing to help you develop factories for that lower industry, because now they want to pivot towards the middle class industry and create jobs. This means, for example, that they're fine with creating factories for you where you produce these cheap goods, whereas they are going to be, are going to be designing these things. You're going to create the fabricated goods, etc. That is to say, they are willing to help you develop into these lower economic status. We therefore say you also have just more likely to even have factories. Like not only is Chinese states more likely to invest in you, but also like Chinese companies and like Chinese investors. We therefore say this is like a knock-on spillover effect towards economic development. Sure, closing.
Why do you need to pivot away from Russia in order to be able to take this investment?
Sure. Firstly, know that at the moment that you're going to like sell gas and oil towards China, that Russia's also doing that in the status quo, and therefore you're directly competing against Russia's interest and wants it with the money. Secondly, at the moment you're going to take more loans from China, you're going to take less loans from, for example, Russia, or less infrastructure being allowed to be built by Russia. We therefore say it's inherent trade-off. Okay. Thirdly, also note that at the moment they're going to talk, for example, about Russia becoming angry. Note that in the status quo they can't do anything because they're economically tied to the fact that they are having a Ukraine, which is huge, expensive, and like huge amount of tariffs on them. We therefore say you're much more likely to also have like stable points that China is willing to invest in you to make sure that like Russia's not going to invade you later, or at least make it so they economically depend on you, and then China becomes angry at Russia and says Russia is less likely to invade you in the first place. Why? So what does this mean? Firstly, you get a steady supply of infrastructure which helps for your economy, which is needed because firstly, note that oftentimes to develop your economy, you need to be sure that you're going to have the stable income in the first place, because projects are very long term and they need to adapt to changing things like the fact that you, for example, now have created new bottlenecks and like you need new infrastructure being built, or the fact that you have climate change and therefore maybe ports need to switch and that kind of thing. But secondly, also know that you just create more stability in the place in the first place, right? Being it just creates more job opportunities and more stable jobs means you're less likely to have, for example, individuals job hopping or being fired more easily, and all those kinds of things means that it's better for them because they also have less stress within the economy to make sure that they have more spending power. We therefore say also Russia is a bad economic actor to do this. First, note that big companies often run by in Russia are run by based on despotism and oligarchs. That's to say, oftentimes the big companies are not really to make that much of are not really that competing towards, for example, other companies. Whereas Chinese companies are more meritocratic based, as there is some form of capitalism in there where they need to compete with other Chinese companies, but they also have the added benefit of the fact that there are going to be Chinese ministers on the boards who are going to make sure that they're not creating bubbles, right? That is why there is so good regulation, for example, the housing market comparatively, or even the tech bubble, where they're actively trying to make sure that they don't create bubbles because they want a stable economy, because they want to continue to grow, and at the moment you're going to bubble, it's going to massively harm you economically and your stability. Therefore, they say you're much more likely to have also good companies willing to, for example, place their departments or go also to your countries to sell stuff. We also say that Russia is an unstable investment, not only because of the war that's happening right now, but also note, right, Russia has invaded Ukraine, but also Georgia before it, right? Russia has been shown that it's willing to go against you for multiple reasons. First note, at the moment that Putin is going to lose election sites, or that he feels like there's not enough people supporting him, then he's going to invade the regions of your country. That's happened to Georgia, where they also had massive killings of the minorities there. I think that's also terrible. But secondly, we also say, oftentimes they still see it as spiritual ground, right? There's some spiritual ground from the USSR that Russia still has right to own in the first place. That is to say, Russia might be happy with you today because they are unable to win Ukraine. However, are not sure you're going to be able to actually allow Russia to continue doing this in the long term, because they might turn against you. We say you're much more likely to actually have more stability because you're now more likely, China's more likely, you're therefore willing to step up for you, but also you're much more likely to know this and therefore have more safeguards in place to make sure that your oil and gas lines are going to be protected in the first place. We therefore say, for all those reasons, China is a way better investment than Russia. We say, because the fact that you don't want to compete with Russia on gas, there is not that much complementary economics there from Russia. You only can vote for China. You should vote for China.
Alright, we thank Prime Minister very much for that fine speech. Can we now invite the leader of the opposition to open the case beside the opposition?
Just to make sure I look good for the camera. Thank you. Right, starting in 5 seconds. What do we support inside opposition? Notice, we support status quo. This means that these countries still have some sort of trade with China. Fair, we're fine to bite the bullet and say this is maybe not going to be to the same extent as government will give you, but still the idea is the same. So why is China still likely to invest on our side of the house? Notice that China needs like pipelines and other stuff, infrastructurally speaking, to send its goods to Europe and things like this. This is Belt and Road. This is literally something that is already happening. But also, China needs resources from these countries, that is, things like potassium, copper, coal, and things like this. So there is necessarily still trade on both sides of the house. fair enough. Government gets more of that. We think that's fine. We still say you get a lot of universal health. One response to opening opposition. I'm going to leave the rest to Novak. Guy's really good with this. Honestly, listen to him. So when they say, China is going to fund your infrastructure and everything else. Number one, this happens on both sides of the house. Firstly, it is strategic to do these things because you need to get to Europe. This is Belt and Road. This is what they usually, this is what they previously said. Secondly, you want to buy oil and gas from these countries. You need pipelines, right? So this is something that necessarily also happens on our side of the house. But also secondly, even if this is not true, notice that in order for this to happen, you're literally going to need decades to build the infrastructure. The infrastructure with Russia was built during the Soviet period. You're going to need decades, and this is a time in which your economy is like staggering, and this is something that is very important. So, argument number one, Russia will not let this happen. There are multiple reasons why this is true. Notice, number one, Russia has lost majority of its allies. Now they only have Belarus and some of these countries, right? Secondly, this is an extremely geopolitically important place, right? Notice that this is something that protects the southern borders. It's basically a buffer zone. Thirdly, Russia has invested heavily in these countries through history. Notice this means political and economic capital. They need to still have this. They don't want to let this go. But fourthly, they just have huge influence over this country in general. So how does this Russia not letting this happen look like? Number one, they manipulate elections by like cyber attacks and things like this. Secondly, they fund right-wing activists and groups in order to like coup the state and everything else. But thirdly, they just use the influence through media that they control in this country to turn everything to havoc and everything else. But finally, they stop supply of energens. How do you call this? So they stop the supply, right? Notice that there's no pipelines with China, so you can't just switch to the other thing. You're going to need decades to build this. This is something that happens on our side of the house. Why is this important? Few impacts. Number one, this necessarily leads to less stability compared to what opening government tells you more stability, right? But this also means that you can't economically develop in this particular period. This is something that literally harms lives. But also politically, notice that no stability means you get terrible political actors to rise in these countries, and this is important. Second argument, why is this particularly the worst time to do these kinds of things? Notice two things. One, Russia does not have a lot of allies. This is the first part of my first argument, right? Secondly, they don't have a lot of trade partners, given that they're currently under sanctions from most countries, right? This is uniquely a terrible time to do this kind of policy. Why is this true? Number one, notice that that there is a huge export of goods. Like these countries can now export goods to large Russian market. Plus, they have no competition here, very little competition. Number two, Russia needs a lot of these goods, right? Because this is the only supplier they have. But thirdly, you can sell these goods for a higher price on our side of the house, given that you have more leverage. But also notice that Russia tries to export its own shit to these countries, right? Given that they have sanctions with other countries and they don't have many buyers, right? Meaning that you have a bigger leverage as these countries you're talking about, meaning that you can get oil and gas for cheaper prices on our side of the house. Why is this important? No, thank you. Number one, it's generally important for citizens to have cheaper oil and gas. I think this is logical and I don't need to necessarily explain it. Secondly, you're economically more comparative because number one, you can have cheaper transport of goods, right? But secondly, you can produce goods more cheaply. But also thirdly, you generally look more stable compared to, for example, some European countries that don't have oil or gas and where oil and gas is ridiculously expensive, right? But thirdly, notice that economies of these countries and Russia are designed in a particular way to be compatible one with another. What does this mean? This means that factories, infrastructure, and agriculture are designed to be compatible with Russian. This is something that was built during the Soviet period because they thought that this is going to be the only partnership they're going to have for history and everything else. So what does this necessarily mean? What does this look like in practice? Number one, this means that roads of these countries lead to Russian cities. This also means that they make only mostly the goods that the Russian market needs. But this also means that Russia makes the goods that they need in return and everything else. This also means that machines in factories use the Soviet parts, which are very hard to find somewhere else on other markets and everything else. Also, this means that citizens speak Russian, meaning there is an easier trade and everything else. Meaning that the economies of the two countries are ridiculously compatible one with another. This was like the logic of the Soviet Union and how they have to be compatible in order to keep this trade ongoing and ongoing. So why is this important? Notice that this is going to be extremely expensive to change on our side of the house. You're going to need so much money, even if China is willing to do this. I don't necessarily know whether they'll be able to pull it off and whether they'll be willing to pull it off given how much it costs. But even if this is not true, this is literally going to take decades for you to have this, right? Notice that it took decades to build it in the first place. Now you need to switch it all and give it, like have everything switched on the other side. This is something that necessarily takes decades and decades and decades. I'll take closing.
First you say there is status quo and there is no change economically, then you analyze a lot of economic changes. What are you standing for?
I literally don't understand that comparative. I don't know what my first and last part of the argument was. You should have been more precise in that POI. So anyway, notice that this is going to take so much time. Well, this literally means decades, right? So why is this important? What does this mean? This means that you're going to have a period of 15 to 20 years when you're underdeveloped, well, like you're economically underperforming. This means that you're going to have more instability and more poverty in these countries. But this also necessarily means that the part of, like, notice that the part of its export of oil and gas of these countries goes through Russia to other European states, meaning that Russia is going to block these things necessarily in order for, like, to ban you and to be rude to you and everything else, meaning that you can't sell your own shit to other countries, meaning that you have more instability and more poverty on our side of the house. Notice, panel, this is never going to work. Russia is going to be a terrible actor. They're never going to let you do this. Notice also that you have such a compatible economy, and this is literally the worst time to do all sorts of these things. We are very happy to stay on the Russian side only for this particular debate, but not in anything else. Thank you.
Alright, next we have another horrifying speech. Can we now call on Deputy Prime Minister Please here?
Is it okay if I put this aside? Just two housekeeping notes before I start my speech. One, if you're watching this, I'm currently a teacher. This is not my own opinion I'm defending. I got assigned a position because I'm at the most nerdy activity ever. I hope you're watching this because you want to become a better debater. If so, don't. I really want to drink beer, but instead I'm here in a sweaty room with a bunch of debaters. Second housekeeping note. Hi family. Ready? If the year was the late 1990s, then opening opposition will be definitely correct. But currently the times have changed and the character of all these Central Asian nations have drastically changed. Note that we're not living in a time where the roads are only funded by Russia. The European Union has drastically invested here to make sure that they had ties with it. I think opening opposition is incredibly outdated. Secondly, I think Tal is correct. They're incredibly inconsistent on opening opposition. On the one hand, they say, we defend status quo. On the other hand, drastic change what's going to happen in their side of the house. I think nobody needs to choose what they're going to do because currently they don't have anything to stand on. Firstly, why the two are mutually exclusive, then weighing for Piotr's case, then trashing in Georgia, then why Russia is bad, then why China is good. Why are they mutually exclusive, China and Russia? There are three reasons. Firstly, there's always a trade-off with who you're developing ties with. That is to say, there's just a maximum amount of goods that you can actually export to one of these nations. That is to say, at the moment I decide to give them to China, that automatically means already some pivot away from Russia, because I'm frankly not selling these goods to them. I don't think that's that hard. But two more structural reasons. One, China is frankly not interested in working with you at the moment that you don't. For the simple reasons that if ties are still politically close with another hegemony, then they're very unlikely to feel like they can actually make any change in these countries, spend the loans in the way they want, according to the BRI ideology. Therefore, they're very unlikely to want to help you. You have to do an active pivot away from Russia. But secondly, even China wants to pivot away from Russia. Note that in order for China to show they're a reliable actor to other countries in the BRI, they need to show that they're pivoting away from a country that's going into an illegal war based on pure aggression. There's no way how you can do it under opposition. Weighing on Piotr's case, I think we're already beating our well on two grounds. Firstly, we give systemic reasons why China is a more reliable and sustainable actor. Note that Piotr explains to you how Russia is currently facing severe sanctions. This extends to the actual people on the ground. Think about the local shop owner that simply is not getting their goods the other day because Russia had another sanction again and they were unable to get their goods again, make Haifa goods again, and then export this to the Central Asian nations. Therefore, you simply don't have any reliable actor. We tell you, you only have that under government. Secondly, note that we are on the long term. I think opening up position is fairly contingent on some short-term harms. Namely, you're going to spend some money. We say we're absolutely fine with that because we see that these economies have a large chance of flourishing. The thing that is currently stagnating that is the reason that Russia is still blocking the path to them. At the moment that we can get rid of them, that's the first step that we can actually build. That is to say, we might not show an active way of losing money, but opening opposition is losing money every single day, which we could have on our side of the house. We're fine allocating that money, investing in it, because we get way more back on our side of the house. What do we get from opening opposition? So firstly, they say China trades from both sides of the house. Note that it's a comparative. At the moment that you're still with Russia, China is way less likely to do so. We prove to you why you have unique benefits. At the moment that you do with China more, we think every good more is a shop owner that now gets their goods, is a person that's now more likely to get their food in time on the day, is the export of more oil to other countries, meaning that you can drastically increase your GDP, help that for your local population. We think that there's all things that are impossible to happen under opposition. Secondly, they say Russia won't let it happen. My intuitive response is, so what? Firstly, they say, okay, but they're going to manipulate elections. I think this is drastically non-comparative. Note that Russia is currently already facing a drastic fear that these countries are pivoting away from them. They literally, all their analysis is status quo. Namely, at the moment that they feel like there's any kind of criticism, Russia censors it. At the moment that they feel like there's a new candidate standing up that is very anti-Russia, they already want to censor it. We think that the current ones that are going up there are already there, despite their best efforts of Russia. We think these countries do a great job in already pivoting away. This is about countries like Kazakhstan. I think then there is the way of between us is in some cases they're right, in some cases we are. Why are we right in more cases then? Basically, what they can say is, okay, but Kazakhstan is now going to fear more censorship. We think that's fine because Kazakhstan is already in an economy that is already drastically pivoting away from Russia. They may say, but then we get massive censorship in Georgia. Sure, but we think in Georgia it's already very hard to get away from this, from any way of the censorship. I see literally no delta on opening opposition. Secondly, they say, but pipelines. Central Asia is basically self-sufficient at this point. Note that the biggest exporter of oil and gas is Kazakhstan, that already is exporting it to these nations. Therefore, they literally don't need Russia for this. They are literally doing it better by themselves because they already have those pipelines. Therefore, on their side of the house, I think it's way likelier that Russia at some point will just say, we force you now to stop selling because we have close political and economic ties, and at the moment that you keep selling oil, your competing is out of the market, and we're going to have sanctions on you. We think that this is a slowly crippling, a slow knife for these countries that prevents them from flourishing in any side. If they want to say, okay, but they're going to start military intervention, and I think it would be not the most strategic if they do, Russia is toothless at this point. They drastically undershot what they were going to do in Ukraine. Literally, they're currently using jets that end with the number 61, which is literally the year in which they were built. It is simply impossible for Russia to start any conventional war at any time. Therefore, I think that in the opening opposition, we simply get no growth whatsoever. We get it on our side of the house. I would like to take a few live closing. Marina? I would have engaged very intelligently. I think they should at least take two. Cool. Then why is Russia so bad? I think very clear note. We can concede that Russia has been good so far, and it has done some good things. However, we think that now is the unique time to do it well. They say it's a unique bad time because Russia is on their back. We tell you that actually opens us a door to actually do this on their own terms. Firstly, because Russia is frankly an unstable actor. They get sanctioned all the time, which also harms these nations. We simply never know what kind of weird things they're going to pull in future. And on our side of the house, we know we have a benevolent actor that is going to help us. But secondly, you know that Russia is frankly complementary to these nations. Opening opposition says you have complementary infrastructure. Note that it changed a lot since the Soviet time. All these railways and roads got outdated. They are supported. We now have new ones that are supported by the EU. I have no idea why you want to maintain some old roads, which also cost money at the moment that you can frankly build new ones. They also need to spend money, they need to engage with it. We tell you secondly, you frankly have similar goods like oil and gas. There's simply no help actually in there. I have no idea why you want to engage with that. Secondly, finally know why China is good. We frankly give you lots of mechanisms why they are likely to do this well. Firstly, at the moment that these economies default, that's very harmful for China. They are very unlikely to apply a strategy of death diplomacy. They are much likelier to actually make sure that they get their money back. Because at the moment that these countries default, then the governments that are currently anti-Russia are likely to get voted out, and then China has basically royally fucked up every plan they wanted to have. But finally, we tell you, they provide infrastructure. They're good at it. They put a 750 kilometer railway from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, the things that they need. You don't get the middle class trap. We have unique leverage because we're more developed than other prominent actors in the BRI, like Congo-Brazzaville, like Pakistan. That is a way better leverage that you can have over those goods, way better than over Russia. I'm very proud of developing that.
Alright, thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that speech. Now, we start with your leadership and call on Deputy Governor. Give here.
So let's do a little bit of a rebuttal on their case and the things that don't really make sense. I will add even 2 more arguments to our case and then finish with a little bit of weighing and why we go over opening government. And they were good, but not good enough, guys. Okay, so here's the thing. Like they do they do focus on infrastructure, but what's the thing? At first they tell you, the first speaker, oh, this is for decades this region was economically stagnated, and they did tell us, oh, it's not the 90s. Look, this region is tied to Russia. The infrastructure was built there. What Georgia tells you is that yes, there is Chinese investment. It would be ridiculous to claim that these countries would not work with China at all. It's obvious that in either world there is somewhat of working together with the other power, not complete isolation, because that's the way countries function. But the question is here, who is their main ally? Who is the ally that has the most influence on them? And let's see what they tell us. First, they tell us China is a reliable actor, Russia is not. They are right, Russia is not really reliable. But here's the thing, guys, neither is China in a lot of ways. Like, I'm gonna give you multiple reasons. First, you have the risk of the trade war with the US, all of that escalating sanctions and so on. Secondly, you have a very realistic risk of a war with Taiwan in the following years. Like, they have made it officially their objective to reclaim the territory. Thirdly, you have massive bubbles within the Chinese economy, like both in housing, both in other things. Fourthly, like with China's other conflicts with other countries, it has faced like energy shortages and so on, whether parts of its economy were not able to function due to a lack of coal and all of that. Fifthly, like notice that there is instability within China, like in its western provinces with the Uyghur, in Tibet and so on. Sixthly, like notice that China has tensions with other countries also, like India, which complicates things even further. Meaning that on both sides we don't have a Denmark on either side. There are no very reliable countries here. But what is important is who is better. They tell you this is better in the long term, but in order to prove that, we need to prove that we are actually efficiently able to get to the long term. That's why in their first speech they pretty much ignore Russia's whole position in this. And I say that it is ridiculous, and even the analysis of the PM proves that Russia will simply stand by and let these countries that are crucial for its geopolitical position slide into someone else's sphere of influence. So here's the thing, what it will do. Not that it will fund censorship. Like, okay, yeah, that isn't comparable, but that's not what we care more about here. The thing that Russia will do when it sees that countries are slipping away is fund terrorist groups and separatist movements within these countries. It will radicalize the Russian and other minorities, ethnic and religious minorities within these countries. It will do everything in 2 goals. One will be to pressure the government into changing its stance, But if that doesn't work, then sow enough chaos to make sure that the country cannot move forward and not become a reliable partner to someone else. So that's the thing that you guys have to defend. And even in the PM's speech, they do talk about how Russia could in the future intervene militarily. They realize that that doesn't support their case, so then the deputy prime minister goes against them. So let's see that risk of intervention, because I think that that is an argument on our side. So they tell you the Russian military is depleted and is not functioning in Ukraine. Of course, some of that is true. It is underperforming. But notice that for months, Ukraine has not been able to get the Russian military with all the support from the West, with all the sanctions, with all the new equipment. They have not been able to get them out of their country, and sadly. So here's the thing. What we believe is that if necessary, Russia in the future, maybe not right now, but the thing with Ukraine will end, and we are talking about a process that will take decades. In the future, Russia will be, especially by funding separatist groups and so on, will be able to at least invade some of these countries if necessary as a last resort. Why is this bad? In case of invasion, that's a game over for your side, for the government, because even if they prove like marginally better economic growth, the idea of your countrymen dying in a war, even if at the end, even if they win the war, like notice how terrible that is, how many people are dying and so on. So let's see what's another thing that we'll bring to you. Okay, so here, so here's the thing. Another piece of information is very crucial. Millions and millions of people within these countries live and work in Russia, and they send money to their families, helping them survive. Because in these countries do have a weaker economy than Russia's, even when Russia is under sanction. So let's see what can Russia do to even further destabilize these countries. Well, at the moment when they want to really sabotage them, they will simply, and since they are not very democratic, they have the political capital to do this, they will simply exile millions of workers back to their home country, where they are left without any way to get. They are left without jobs. They are left without a place to work, both them and their families. This leaves tens of millions of people without a livelihood, and it leaves them in a very unstable country. Like, this is terrible for them, which makes it even easier for Russia to sabotage these countries, but also it ruins the lives of tens of millions of people. Like, it's not easy, and we know that China is not going to take them in, because China would not take in millions of people as workers, because they would need to vet them, and so on. They will not be compatible. Closing, go.
Yes, you say Russia will backlash. Why do you think China wants backlash if you side with Russia and not China?
Okay, here's the thing, because what is the status quo? For decades, Russia has put its intelligence services here, has bought the media, put decades of control into these countries, meaning that it is the status quo. It is the one protecting all of that. So it's far less likely for China to simply attack some of these countries, especially because China, to a certain degree, does want good relations with Russia, or at least to keep them stable, if not good, because that is their northern border. So they would not be so reckless to simply attack them, to attack one of the satellites. Get closer, sure. If China would love to get these countries on its side in a process of decades, but never in all out. And plus, they have other priorities like Taiwan and so on. So many other things that they need to focus on. Okay, so let's weigh the things. Here's the thing. If winning this debate was proving 1.5% more economic growth, then OG brings that. There is probably some more infrastructure on their side and so on. But what we prove to you, and this is the analysis, we're not talking about like Western Europe with economic frame. We're proving you that this puts these countries in existential risk. This means more terrorist groups, and with that means more instability. That means more death. That means that at least some of them will be invaded. Many of them don't even have gas, like Uzbekistan, and those can be sanctioned. Not all of them have gas. So look, either way, we bring to you like the safety of these countries. Like, let's be realistic and so on. And Kazakhstan, biggest exporter of potassium.
All right, thank the leader of the opposition for a very fine speech. To open the closing speech, this debate can call a member of government. Please hear this.
I've gotten used to these nice platforms. Forgive the sunglasses. I'm not an asshole. I just have an eye problem. Many assholes look cool. Okay. I will begin my speech panel with your permission in 3, 2, 1. In a dog-eat-dog world where countries conquer other countries just because they can, countries have to be within the influence sphere of a world power. They have to be protected by the right superpower. In World War II, Poland counted on France, who proved unwilling or unable to punish Nazi Germany for their assault. Russia is a mean, failing, and unreliable world power, while China is a rising one who has very few conditions they give. Let's talk about the economics very quickly. There may be some better trade conditions, there may be some better lending, but as OO challenge, this is fairly symmetric. China's economic interests go outside of their sphere of influence. For example, the US, their primary ally, their primary enemy, is also their biggest export destination. What does change? We're going to talk shortly about economic sovereignty. We're going to talk in depth about security. We're going to explain about the problematic circumstances under which the quote-unquote alliance between Russia and these Central Asian states was first signed, and why switching to China allows them to have a better alliance. Let's get into it. So starting with economic sovereignty, we think that while countries direct trade with each other doesn't necessarily matter, economics also play a part in geopolitics insofar as border disputes or international regulations affect specific countries' economic interests. This looks like fights over borders or over sea territory and fishing rights, over shared water supplies like the Nile, or over resource-rich areas such as Caucasian mountains. It looks like fighting for the interest of your ally, fighting for the interests in UN resolutions or against UN resolutions that hurt them, and someone who has the ability to ensure your economic sovereignty as well as the interest and ability to do so. Russia lacks the interest and ability. But let's move quickly into security. And security divides into two parts. It divides into deterrence and it divides into active protection of my sovereignty. So let's start with deterrence, because what superpowers provide for their allies is firstly training. This looks like America providing Ukraine with training before the war, or sending commandos to Afghanistan to try to prop up the regime. But more importantly, it looks like military gear. And this is crucial because you need military gear for defense of anti-aircraft, anti-tanks, anti-submarines, you need missile defense systems. And because the military world has constant advancements, falling behind by even a decade can be super dangerous. Smart missiles that manage to get past your missile defense system make your missile defense system obsolete. Anti-tank missiles that can pierce the armor of your tanks make your tanks obsolete. As the superpowers and many of their allies are constantly getting the newest weaponry, this looks like America providing countries like Israel or Turkey with F-35 planes, you have to remain in this race. Note, countries don't just want to have defensive, they also want to have offensive abilities. This isn't necessarily an absolute good, but given how much these countries invest in their offensive capabilities, mostly in order to deter, we know that it is within their interests. Note, you also need continuous support of your allies. You need access to replacement parts, to technicians. For example, in Operation Retribution, the Yugoslavian, I read into this a little bit later, the Yugoslavian Air Force had lots of great planes, they just didn't have access to any of the replacement parts or technicians, making their planes obsolete. But beyond just the deterrence of having the right gear and having support for it over the decades, you need to have an alliance because people know that your ally will give backup. This looks like NATO, but you don't have to actively say, oh, I'm in a treaty organization with this person. It also looks like the 6th Fleet sitting by Taiwan constantly, even though America doesn't even officially recognize Taiwan, but Taiwan is within their sphere of influence, so they do ensure its protection through that deterrence. This also prevents anyone who is allied with that same superpower from hurting me. This looks like the US paying both the Israeli and Egyptian security systems billions of dollars a year each, because if any of them are aggressive towards the other, that funding gets cut. I'll explain this comparatively with Russia and China soon, but secondly, the active protection of my sovereignty. This looks like in a war, such as Israel in the 6-Day War, reaching super close to Cairo and Damascus and stopping because the USSR said, if you go further, we are going to nuke you. That is what's going to happen. And the Americans said, okay, if they nuke you, we're not nuking anyone back, so you better stop. But this also looks like protecting me in the modern fields of warfare, like cyber warfare, like having access to satellites, like in a world where quantum computers are maybe a decade away from breaking all classical methods of cryptography, and therefore every country's banking systems and secrets are going to be accessible, it's having access to quantum cryptography, which countries like China invest dramatically in. It looks like active protection from the alternative superpower, because countries like the UK and the US, when they were a single power controlling the world, simply conquered every island, because, you can, and there's some bird poop there, which is useful for certain stuff. The only possible counter to such a powerful force is the alternative superpower. So let's talk about the comparative between Russia and China here. Russia is falling behind in the quality of their military gear, in their military advancements, in the availability of gear and commanders that they can give people to train. They did it recently for Assad, and they didn't manage to beat the rebels, the disparate, weakened rebels. And now they're incredibly busy in a war in Ukraine. Their economy is devastated, and they're never going to be able to provide this security protection again. Secondly, China is rich and militarily powerful. They invest in smart tech, like drones, like smart scopes, like quantum computing centers or cyber warfare. China also has dramatic leverage over the US. Unlike Russia, who basically cut most of their trade ties, the US and China have dozens of different mechanisms for deterring each other and small methods of escalation that they can use to each other. Beyond that though, China has to, yeah, I think you're right, opening.
Look, even if you're right, you're probably not, but notice that this debate is in the current day. Why is this not possible to do it 15 years from now with the situation, especially when we give you so many reasons why now it's not possible?
I think my partner will engage with that. I don't think that's critical to me. Look, China has to prove right now that they stand by their allies in order to maintain their allies and in order to expand their sphere of influence to new allies. If you abandon an ally once, you don't get to grow. This is why it's crucial to do it now. Right now, China is growing. China is replacing Russia as the world's second superpower and is close to replacing the US, maybe a decade or two away. Once they replace them, they no longer have the interest. Just like the US doesn't care about Central Asian states, they have nothing to gain from them, so will China once they become the dominant power. Right now is the moment where China wants this. Note, switching to China allows us for a better alliance because the alliance with Russia was forced. Russia treated these countries horribly in living memories. This is murder, this is gulags, this is trauma, this is no acknowledgement of this. This is continuous taking advantage of them through the kleptocratic system of Russia being exported and people like Gurbangali controlling countries like Kazakhstan with the same type of kleptocracy in Russia. China against China, they're in a better negotiating position. China is dying for the allies. These countries are already sovereign. Because China is going to be a better, more trustworthy superpower ally, because Russia fails them and they need this security and they need their sovereignty, go with closing government.
Cool. We thank you, Member of the Cabinet. I'm coming out and trying to make our opposition to the speaker.
Everyone ready? I will deal with CG, then I will talk about a trade-off and point out that just because some things are not in the motion, that doesn't mean they don't exist. And I will look at the self-determination of people and why that is the most important thing that you should care about in this debate. And if I have time, I'll tell you why China is actually not that great an actor, because OO does some job on it, but not sufficient. Now, here's the problem with CG. CG tells you, well, you need weapons from China and Russia doesn't have the newest weapons. But what do you need weapons for, right? You need weapons to protect from an invader. Who could potentially invade any of these countries? Presumably Russia, and they're presumably much more likely to do that on their side of the house if you piss them off. Now, notice that just because the motion asks you to choose one of them, I don't understand why it is actually not possible to keep having ties with both of them. And I think OO does a pretty good job at explaining why it is still possible. I will also look more into that. But looking at the training and military gear and the great weapons, like maybe Russian weapons were not sufficient to make Assad win in Syria, but they were definitely effective enough to turn Syria into basically a pile of rubber. I'm sorry, I do not care who has more powerful weapons, because in the end the population loses regardless of which side has more powerful weapons. We'd rather not get to the point where you need to have weapons in the first place. But secondly, notice that European Union in the status quo tends to provide these weapons where necessary to countries that are attacked by both either Russia or China. I am unsure why in either side of the house the EU and the US wouldn't be willing to help these countries if it is needed. Now, who would not help them? China. Do you know why? Because China has its own interests in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. What does that look like? It looks like China consistently trying at every single step to shape international consensus and international policies and international bodies away from a world where superpowers are legitimate and able to intervene to defend the sovereignty of small nations, because it hurts China's interests. I am unsure why China is now going to prioritize these countries above its own interests to the point of going and helping them in the event that Russia does try to intervene. Additionally, what they leave out is that currently Russia is a huge trade partner of China, right? Because China does have enough demand and even more demand for oil and gas than Russia alone or these countries alone can supply. So I'm unsure why the trade-off actually exists. But additionally, like OO tells you the economies are designed to be complementary. So like I'm unsure already why you compete with Russia. But I think just look at the logic of their case, right? Given that demand for oil and gas is currently in China and India and generally in the eastern economies that are growing much higher than these countries already can produce, that means that there's always more room for more of these to be bought. But if what OG wants to happen, that is China invests and creates new economic activity, then that is the economic activity that now also needs to get exported. I am unsure why I need to substitute existing economic activity and say, well, you know, you can't export to someone else because you're already exporting your goods to Russia. If what they actually want is to generate new economic activity. But also, notice that what happens is that China does actually have a large interest in countries defaulting on some of their loans, because at the moment when they do, they get to own crucial infrastructure that is much more powerful and much more valuable to them than money, because it is something that money cannot even buy. It is something that allows them not only to make a lot more money because they control these key points, but it also allows them to control the geopolitical spheres of influence in whichever countries they do. That is why Sri Lanka is literally in default right now, despite all of the investment that China has poured into them. But also like on the silly idea of OG that like China will make sure there's no economic bubble and everything, like China currently is weak and its economy is actually shrinking because it wasn't even able to prevent its own housing bubble at home. The reason for that is because China's economy is actually even more than Russia's reliant on propping up their own people, on propping up corruption and nepotism, because they want to maintain political control. They do so even at the expense of economic growth. That is why they're literally breaking up their largest tech companies, not because even in doing so, they are forcing them into losing economic power, and they're making them weaker in competing with American companies, but they're doing so because allowing them to grow would actually threaten them. Russia, yes, is backed by oligarchs, but it's still largely free market, and it was having very numerous trade ties with the EU and US until they got cut off. Now, let's look at why the economy is not a good in itself, right? We use economy as a tool for the well-being of citizens, right? A strong economy and citizens having income is one metric. I think government already loses on that metric anyway, but it's not the only metric, and I also don't know why it's the most important metric, because many people's revealed preference is for autonomy over more cash that they might not be able to spend if their country is politically destabilized, or if their country is cut off from the countries where the rest of their family lives. Not only that, but you literally cannot buy things like safety and national belonging, and that is also something that government sacrifices for literally no reason. That is also something they need to defend. I will not take opening.
Yeah, these countries are unique in reliably supplying goods and oil to China, giving them a unique position to different BRI nations. China knows this, they cannot fuck them over, Russia can.
Another problem is China is currently not necessarily looking to develop middle classes anywhere, because it's looking to develop its own middle class. Its population is shrinking, which means that it is moving away from the low-skilled, cheap labor that propped up its economy, and it needs to move it abroad in order to continue to produce it and continue to reap benefits. So the investments that China makes are not to prop up a middle class somewhere else, because if they want to prop up someone's middle class, it will be at home, because at home there is a growing demand for more access to more and more things, as there is already a middle class that is growing and whose demands are also growing. So I genuinely don't think that China is such a good investor. But even if it was, I've given you a lot of reasons why what it's done so far proves it's not. You need to actually engage with what's happened empirically rather than what you assume China would want to do. At the macro level, self-determination is not going to be great on either side of the house. If you're a small country in the influence of a superpower, you're always going to be manipulated into voting whatever they want in the UN. I'm unsure why being manipulated by China is better than or worse than being manipulated by Russia, and I don't think I care. Russia has the incentive to help you because there is a large diaspora of Russians living in these countries, and there are large amounts of these groups living in Russia. That means not only that there is a lot of political demand for this, but there are also a lot of ties that now would get interrupted. People are no longer able to see families across the border. Not only that, but the people that are not tied to Russia culturally in these countries in the status quo, who would anyway have a strong preference towards Russia, are Muslims. I don't think I need to tell you what China is doing to Muslim Uyghurs at home. The problem with the citizens of these countries, seeing their countries pivoting away from people they see as their brothers towards someone who is oppressing people they identify with because they are the same religion, they are the same as them, makes them feel threatened, makes them feel unsafe, makes them feel abandoned. Everyone is unhappy, whether people who are already ideologically aligned to Russia and now deprived of ties to their own families, or people who are not, who would still prefer Russia above China. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the member of the opposition for that fine speech. And now the last speech, we come to the bench from call government procedure. you for a very kind speech. And now for the final speech of this debate, can we call on the opposition to please?
Before I start, I also want to say this was a position that was allocated to me. The things I will say don't necessarily are my personal opinions, so please keep that in mind during my speech. Start in 3, 2, 1. What is my structure? I will first do rebuttal and explain why Mir's rebuttal already wins over both gov teams. Secondly, framing a bit for the debate. Third, why Mir's demographic analysis wins the debate outright, and I will weigh this, why we prefer identity, sovereignty, etc. over economic outcomes, and why these economic outcomes on their side is probably not likely and they don't prove it enough. First of all, the CG, if China and Russia are so intertwined, it's very questionable why they will intervene, because they will harm their own market, right? If there is war. Secondly, if these countries have this much tension and they go war on each other, who will China prioritize? Which market will they help? Where will they send the troops? I think these are all questions that need to be answered in CG for them to stand, so I don't think that's sense. And thirdly, Mir pointed out probably the biggest threat to them is Russia, so if they actually want to control history books, if they want to control the language, the media, etc., they won't want to do this. This is their own analysis. Okay, then secondly, I think that Russia is very powerful. First of all, the climate crisis, the Siberian caps are like melting. There's a lot of oil and gas underneath that, so just by waiting a little bit, they will have even more resources. Secondly, I think that also, like, China wants low-skilled labor. They never engage with this rebuttal from Miri when she says also to OG, look, it's not high-skilled labor that they want. They want to export the low labor there. And it's unclear why the people from Central Asia want that. They never analyze this. They say there's maybe an economic benefit there. And also, like, China is currently suffering from badly economically. I think they never engage with Mir's analysis why China is not doing well at the moment, and I think this is very detrimental for them. So, on framings, I think they don't engage with Mir's framing, which was already to a very marginal extent present in 00, where they say there's Muslims in these countries. Why? Because the Turks were there, the Ottomans. I think that the average intelligent voter knows that a lot of people in the Stan countries are Muslims. Note, but there's also a lot of Russians, meaning that you have different people, different mixtures, etc. Because during the USSR, people were like transitioned to different places in order to keep stability. Note that this is literally the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine, because they pivoted to this is the legitimacy reason, because they say there's so much Russian population in Ukraine that we need to protect. This is the reason when you start to invade. This is when you pivot away and you want to the EU or to China. This is when this happens. Note that this is also a long-term debate, meaning that they have to engage with a long-term analysis of this. It's unclear like why Russia maybe doesn't have the weapons now that they want, but maybe they will have them in the future. But this is all not as important as what Miri brings to, because what is the comparative in the debate and what is actually the metric? Don't team proves why economic harms are the most important or why should we care about this, etc. First, harms to people. What is in the interest of state? I think that the state is not like a vacuum thing that rules over you. I think the state is the different people that live in the state and their preferences. Thus, we need to see what is the thing that most people will agree that is their preference. I think that we tell you that probably what they want is autonomy. They want some kind of sovereignty to like be themselves. Why? Because this is their first priority over economy, etc. Because I only know who I am because I know I'm different from you, and I know, I'm an Orthodox Serb, I'm a Muslim, etc. This is how I know I'm human, meaning that this is the very first priority for people. This is also why people rather die than to be converted, etc. Because and also this is very important in religious cases, because if you die under your religion, you're promised eternal heaven. If you convert, you're not promised eternal heaven. So this is why people don't give up their religion. This is why this is so important to them. Note, China is doing atrocities towards Muslim communities. Even if this is not actually factually true, because some people dispute it, this is what these people believe. When they see atrocities happening to their brothers and sisters, they believe this is happening. There are satellite pictures, etc., that they're doing this. Not in the status quo. There's a lot of there's a lot of Kazakh and Uzbek minorities in Russia, actually, that send remittances back. Note that they have an economic benefit from that, and maybe the Russian media pushes their identity on them, they want them to consume Russian media, etc. This is the comparative that we have to engage with, like history books. But they can have their mosques in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. They can like do this, etc. without feeling threatened. Note that they also have a common history, Russia and these countries, meaning it's unclear why controlling their history books is so detrimental to their identity. They never engage with this. Secondly, I think that Russia is not doing a systematic erasure of Muslim identity. I think this is the comparative to some extent, that there's like, and this is where people's perception of this comes in. I think at the moment, and this is what they want on their side, so the way we can see this, you're going to have more loans from China, you're going to have more trade with China, that means that your money is going more to China. I think a normal citizen will perceive this as I'm helping China do these atrocities. And this is like what the comparative in people's perception in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan is if my money, my labor, etc. goes to these people, I'm helping them do this. This is how they weigh this in their head. Note that the motion says interest of state. They never define what the interest of state is. We say it's their identity, it's them feeling like they are people, etc. And this is, so what is the comparative here on the harms to people? There's a threshold to which you can rationalize the necessity of trade with China. Many are content to the extent that they see like trade with China is good, etc. They never explain to us why it's not sufficient. They just say it's better. But why is this delta better than it could be? A good like thing to weigh against the harms to your identity. No? Secondly, people feel opening.
Okay, the feeling of nationality does not weigh up to not hospital is saving your life and jobs giving you food on the table, while Muslims are also mistreated and discriminated against in Russia and by Russian diaspora. There's literally no delta for you.
Look, this is where feelings come into play. This is where people are, like, to some extent irrational, but also where they just, like, you have to weigh this. Just because you say there's economic benefits, like, why is this true? Like, I would rather die Marina than die Miri. Like, this is, like, I don't understand why this is the weighing. First of all, how does this harm then manifest? This is where the impacting happens. People feel that they contribute a lot more to China. And this money, the weapons, the cryptography, they might feel that this is going directly to finding out where the Muslim communities, where are they hiding, etc. They never explain why these weapons will be used for good things. So why is then econ to this secondaries? First of all, they never explain to us why the trade with Russia will be so detrimental that you will have no food, no economy, nothing. If this is the way that they want, they should have explained it. We think that you still have trade, we think that Russia will also recover in the long term. We give so much rebuttal to this in Miri's speech. But secondly, this explains why you have terrorist funding. Why terrorist funding will find acceptance among people, because these people actually want to be funded to riot against these decisions. Why the state? Because there's also a group on likelihood analysis that is willing to do this. For all of these reasons, vote